Intersectionality of the male gaze. I'm Tansy.
I'm Eliza.
Intersectional theory helps us to understand the experiences that different people have based on their demographics, such as race, class, and gender. For this presentation, we will be focusing on the experiences of women in media and how the male gaze has affected them and their roles.
The male gaze is a media term coined by Laura Mulvey in her book Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema, which describes the way women are depicted in media created by and for men. Women are typically characterized by performing everyday tasks in hypersexualized ways, or sometimes by wearing overly sexualized outfits. It does not necessarily mean that a man is watching, but rather explains people's actions as they perform under the assumption that they could be being perceived by men. Male gaze is a media term, but can also explain the way women act outside of the media because of one's awareness of the possibility that they are being watched transfers into the way that people, specifically women, act in real life. And this has real life effects on women that we are going to get into later. So our first example of the male gaze comes from the show Euphoria with the character Cassie and actress Sydney Sweeney. The show itself portrays the male gaze with the scene of the character having a beauty routine that starts at 4 a.m. and basically she has an identity crisis with her wearing drastically different outfits and aesthetics, and she's doing all of this for the attention of a man. It's also shown throughout the show that she constantly changes her interests and personality to better mesh with men and to get them to like her better. Behind the scenes of the show, there's also an example of the male gaze off screen. The writer and director, Sam Levinson, had to be asked by Sydney Sweeney to not have her topless in so many scenes because she felt like not only was her character being hypersexualized for the point of the storyline, but she as a person was also being overly sexualized. The second example of the male gaze that we came up with also comes from Euphoria with the character Jules and actress Hunter Schafer. Male gaze is portrayed in the performance of femininity that Jules feels she has to put on as a trans woman, especially in sexual relationships with men. It shows how women hypersexualize and change themselves for the attention and validation of men. Again, the effects that the male gaze has on women in real life is shown throughout the differences in episodes written by Hunter Schafer and those written by Sam Levinson. There tends to be a blatant sexualization of the character when Levinson is writing the episodes. This is also an example of intersectionality because of the way in which transgender women are sexualized is different than that of cisgender women. Instead of showing off her body in the way that Levinson did with Sweeney, he instead portrayed Schaefer's character in less moral ways as a cheater and constantly needing sex, which was not like how any of the cis women are portrayed on the show.
Our third example is going to be costumes for female superheroes, and costumes for female superheroes tend to be extremely tight. They may show cleavage, or they replace the pants with a skirt for additional sex appeal, and there is no logical reason as to why they would replace pants with a skirt, especially an extremely short skirt. This adds to the over-sexualization of women in general, and there's just no logical reasoning behind any of the costume choices that are made, especially when their male counterparts have protective gear or they have a costume that just makes sense for their role and for what they're going to be doing. Men can also be affected by the male gaze, specifically excessive muscle shots in movies, because this fuels the male power fantasy, and men may not even realize that those shots are for them. They may think that that is the female gaze, when in reality those are scenes that are built for men.
So, like Tansy said in the last slide, there is also a term called the female gaze, and an example of a show that uses both the male and female gaze is Fleabag. So, the show is written and directed by a woman, Phoebe Waller-Bridge, and utilizes the male gaze in order to show the effects that it has on women in real life. So this is especially shown in Fleabag's hypersexualization of herself, showing that women can act differently because of the way that they have been taught by the media to act. It also shows the dehumanization of people caused by the male gaze by not even naming most of the characters, including main character herself. And it also shows the mental health effects that the male gaze has on women because of this dehumanization and hypersexualization of oneself, and how that leads to loneliness and depression. So Fleabag is also an example of the female gaze because of the way that it portrays women's attraction to men to be more than just physical, which differs from men's attraction to women throughout the show for the most part.
In this research, they studied how attractive different age groups of women were found based on how they were presented in that specific scene. So for our three age groups, we have 13 to 20-year-olds, 21 to 39-year-olds, 40 to 64-year-olds. So the first category we have was dressed in sexy attire, and this, and for 13 to 20-year-olds, they were deemed as 37.3% attractive. For 21 to 39-year-olds, they were deemed as 35.6% of them were attractive, and for 40 to 64-year-olds, 25.2% of them were deemed attractive. For scenes that had some nudity, 13 to 20-year-olds and 21 to 39-year-olds were both deemed as 33.3% attractive, while 40 to 64-year-olds were deemed as 23.3% attractive. And then for overall just being attractive, 13 to 20-year-olds, 13.9% of them were deemed attractive, 21 to 39-year-olds, 12.2% of them were deemed as being attractive, and for 40 to 64-year-olds, 7.2% of them were deemed as being attractive. Overall, we can see that 13 to 21 to 20-year-olds were consistently deemed as being, on average, more attractive than the other two age groups. And 40 to 64-year-olds were consistently deemed as being less attractive than their younger counterparts. This is an extremely disturbing thing, especially when the first group, which is 13 to 20-year-olds, the majority of that age group are minors, with only there being 2 years of them being older than minors. And then 40 to 64-year-olds were consistently deemed as being less attractive, which is also very disturbing when we think about the population of people who may have filled out the survey and with the ages of those people. This study can also show us the effects of the male gaze in television and films, because if overall individuals are finding 13 to 20-year-olds more attractive in sexual scenes, then that is desensitizing them from looking at 13 to 20-year-olds in day-to-day life, and that may be creating an unsafe environment for 13 to 20-year-olds in this day and age, because they are consistently being sexualized in the media. While this also has negative effects for the 40 to 64-year-old group, because this idea that they are deemed as being less attractive than their younger counterparts may give the connotation that by the time you get to a certain age, your career is over in a sexual manner, because it's a lot harder. Because according to the data, it's a lot harder to sexualize a woman who is between the ages of 40 to 64 than it is to sexualize somebody who is younger. Alliance for Women in Media is an organization that supports women in all sectors of the media world, from actors to producers to directors. They are one of the oldest established groups that are dedicated to advancing women in media. They recognize both women but also the people who aid these women in changing the roles and uplifting the concerns of women and their mission, and uplifting the roles of women. Their mission is to create positive change in media by supporting educational program recognition events and scholarships that benefit students pursuing a career in the media field.
So, as we've touched on before, the male gaze does have impacts on women in real life and outside of the media. First, it affects the way that women view themselves, which could be considered the internalized male gaze. There's a quote by Margaret Atwood that explains this that says, "You are a woman with a man inside watching a woman." Essentially, no matter what a woman does or says or who they are around, they are constantly aware of how they are acting from the male perspective, whether it be how they physically appear and appeal to men, or their productivity, or whatever it is. Women's view of themselves almost exclusively comes from external sources of validation. Hypersexualization is one example of this external validation, which uses perceived sex appeal to boost one's self-esteem. Instead of women's bodies belonging to them, the male gaze forces women to view their own bodies as objects to be used to service other people, especially men. Hypersexualization affects all women, but does have a larger effect on women of color because they are specifically being sexualized for their race or ethnicity. This leads to negative mental health effects, like I mentioned earlier, such as dehumanization, which leads to loneliness or depression. The male gaze can lead to mental health impacts in other ways, such as eating disorders. There are gender differences in the symptoms of different eating disorders, which can be, but obviously not always are, caused by the way women are perceived differently by men. Women are more likely to engage in body checking and food avoidance, while men and women are equally as likely to have binge eating habits. Also, the awareness of the male gaze, that there is a possibility of men perceiving someone, has also been shown to lead to an increase in social anxiety. So there are a lot of negative mental health impacts that the male gaze has on women outside of media.